I got to meet Dorothy, what's it, more than 2 years ago. It was my hometown,
No, we were down here, and we did a show on the Schmidt House and
in Tumwater
yes,
proper. Yeah.
And you were, of course, the star, and and it was very good. And then the show went off the air. I don't know why.
So that I went on cable.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it's so great that actually, everybody who's in media is using every lane possible to stay on the air, because it's like being on a mountain. Nothing works the way. I love your video. No, I'm not looking at your name tag. I know who you are.
Oh, okay.
Video. But I love your video.
Talking over old times.
See, I love it so much I can't think of the name. It just dissolves. Talking over old times, and it's a short, different stories like what we're telling now.
Yeah,
going
little
to tell,
3-minute features.
And it's really, really good.
Thank you.
And I, on the other hand. Are you going to tell about it, or you don't know?
Well, I did want to let people know that many of you came because you know Dorothy already through her columns. She's been an author and columnist and a humorist, I guess you'd say. What did it wasn't historian? You had another title.
Folklorist.
Folklorist. Yeah,
I was
like
given
that
title by a friend of yours.
Okay, good. That's right. And I'm learning to be less of a folklorist and learning about being a historian, about accuracy and making sure that you're getting double sourced and get the sources as close to the event as it happened.
Young man, just a moment.
Okay.
I don't like the implication that a folklorist's stories are not double checked and double resourced and all that. They're just shorter and full of hyperbole.
Hyperbole. We love hyperbole. And we're both, you can tell we're both broadcasters. I had a radio background, and she had TV and radio both, and video now. And so we are storytellers. I'm a historian, but not quite. I'm more of a storyteller and learning to be a historian. Let's put it that way. So it's fun to tell the stories behind Paul Harvey,
the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what we're going to do today, isn't it?
Yes, right.
I was never sure. So are you going to tell me? He's so cute. This is the thing. He does not understand that I have 3 kids older than he is, and he really hasn't got a chance, But were you going to tell me about you have? Does your interest in history come from your very famous relatives?
Well, the road is named for my great-grandpa.
Which road would that be, honey?
The one that has soft shoulders and dangerous curves. No, it's a long straight road. It's Trosper Road in Tumwater. 1892, our family got here, and it was named for my great-grandpa. They came here from Kansas. And we were related by marriage to one of the founders of Tumwater. Jesse Ferguson was on the Simmons Bush Party, and he was Uncle Jesse to us. And so my great-grandparents bought 60 acres from Uncle Jesse when they got here in 1892. And then as automobiles started to come in and they started to make county roads, they had the settlers in each part of the county band together and make some of those roads. And so my great-grandfather was a road district supervisor, and because of that, they named it for him. It's not that he's famous or
in
or a
lieu
leader
of payment, or
no payments or
no. Okay.
but it made the rest of us famous. His descendants.
That's wonderful.
So that's what it is. In fact, I think my favorite of my ancestors that would be my grandpa, Bill Trosper, and he was my connection to the 1800s because he was when they got here in 1892, he was 10 years old. And so he worked for Uncle Jesse as a teenager, plowing his fields out where the Mills and Mills Cemetery is on Little Rock Road. And so he would tell all these stories that he lived until I was about 8th grade or 9th grade. 68, I think, is when he passed away. But he married my grandma when he was in his 40s and she was about 20. So a big age difference. So he was the age of a great-grandparent, even though he was my grandpa. And so I had that connection to the 1800s because of him. And I kick myself now because he told all these great stories all the time, and I never had the interest to write it down when I was a kid. And now I wish I would have, because those stories, some of those are lost. But I've heard some of them through my dad and mom and so on. But So that's my favorite ancestor. Do you have a favorite grandparent or?
I have so many. I have, of course, I always say my great-grandma had 24 children.
24.
24. She was both Roman Catholic and profoundly puzzled. And so, but you know, when you do have a big family, you learn something about history, the way, you know, what we've been talking about. I think they're all kind of favorites, but like I always say, my grandma had a monkey on her back. She really did. My uncle brought it back home to her from World War II. And the monkey's name was Susie, and she liked biting people a lot. One of the things that I've really, and my aunt, this is really good. All of my uncles, her children, and my aunt, that's 5 of them, were professional wrestlers who traveled with the carnival. And so that was something to live up to, as you can imagine. But what I've learned, because of having such a large and what you might call active family, is not only is it so important to get those stories, and that's really kind of what we're talking about today, to get the stories, but double check and find out, because my daughter-in-law, who has really taken an interest in the family, bless her, what a nice girl. Anyway, she sent off to Ancestry for Christmas before we knew all these terrible things about them. They wanted me to get our DNA done, and she was trying to contact people, and she found Teddy, a young cousin of mine, Teddy Franco, that I knew as a child myself. I'm about 10 years older than Teddy, but we're in the same group. And so they were really delighted to find each other. But because of this, I had the chance to see how oral history, is passed down wrong.
Yeah.
Because
exaggeration.
And perfectly well. Here's the deal, kid. Teddy, he did remembered growing up together, remembered going to the same functions that we went to, but he told her that my uncle Louis was a Palomino horse rancher, that he had a big Palomino ranch in Oregon, which sounded awful good. Is not true, unfortunately. Uncle Louis had my grandma, the one with the monkey, you remember Susie, the monkey, the biting, okay, that's them. She had a small ranch, was one of the last claim ranches.
Donation
land claim. Mm-hmm. And Uncle Louis, who was a cowboy, who sang, he was a lumberjack, and he was a singing cowboy. Lou Franco and the Singing Cowboys, and he had a beautiful Palomino horse named Sunday. One
horse,
which he would frequently ride into the biggest hotel in Roseburg, Oregon, and create quite a fuss. Sometimes he went to jail, but it didn't seem. He also had a bear. He had a bear. Yes,
on his shoulder.
No. The monkey's on the shoulder.
Okay.
The bear's in the rumble seat, and he would frequently. The bear's name was Cindy, and he would frequently take Cindy. I've even got the newspaper clippings where he took Cindy into town. And then she would get out, she would be chained, because in those days, remember, things were different. She was chained in the rumble seat, and she could get out, walk around, be happy, and she could swat at people who went by, and sometimes she could catch them. Some took offense. So, but I thought it was an interesting example of the fact that he was right, Teddy was right, because he remembered this horse, he remembered the Palomino. But he was completely wrong about what Lou did, what his great aunt did, and it's not necessarily bad. It's only that this is why I think we often don't know the real story.
That's right. And we've got old newspaper editors that have got stories completely wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
From the 1800s, and so it's all history is just your perspective of how you remember it. and everybody has their own version of it, and so that you get as many sources as you can to confirm that it's really true or not.
Yes, and I just wanted said that with my book, I have checked and checked and checked and checked until people have called me names and thrown things at me. And it could be right, could be wrong, but at least I've checked. Does this lead us into what we're going to talk about? Or
Well, we just want to go back and forth with these stories
Well,
from
of
the past
course.
and legends, I guess you'd say, because there's.
Well, what I wanted to do was explain.
Okay,
May
go
I-
ahead. Yes,
may I
yes,
explain?
absolutely.
Okay, so what we're going to do is, in the old days when the world was new, about 4 years ago, my TV show went off the air. And I was really upset about it. I miss me on TV. But anyway, while we were doing the show, over the course of it was close to 15 years, we visited more than 100 communities. And what we did in each community was to say to the people, what do you want people to know about your town? Because nobody ever gets what they want. It's always if there wasn't a murder, there's hardly any point in coming. And so this was an opportunity for them to let us know how they wanted the world to see them. So I'd be in town about a week altogether. And absolutely always, at some point during the week, at least once, somebody would grab me and say, I've got a story to tell you, and you've never heard it before. And they would be right. Well, after the show went off the air and I kicked and screamed and suffered depression and all kinds of things, I decided that I would pitch these stories that people had told me. I thought, gee, that'd make a book, you know. So I pitched it to this means I presented it. You don't throw. You do the throwing later, but this is, and I presented the idea of doing these stories that nobody had heard before. And they said, well, yeah, but you would have to go back and check and be sure that everything is correct and all that. When I went back, I found out a thing that I honestly never knew before, and that was that history keeps living. History doesn't stand still. And when I went back to start checking on these stories, there was more. There were things I hadn't heard. There were things I didn't know. So the book really is the rest of the story.
All right.
We really do tell that. It's not an original thought, but it works. The idea is what I was told, what we were told, and then what we found out, the true story or the rest of the story. So what I was thinking, and then you get to tell stories too.
Okay, sure.
You know, it's
I've
really
got a few here.
It's really, you know how hard it is. Once I'm on a roll, you're going to have to jump in. But what I thought we might do to start with, just because we have nothing else to do anyway. We have nothing else planned and little money. So you heard about the dip jar, didn't you? But let's show how this is maybe going to work. And of course, I think some of my stories we won't know each other's stories.
Yeah,
but here's one everybody in the room knows this story. But the story we were told, we always start out with the story that we told, and this one is from the Oregon Trail ends right here and over there. And the story they tell is that the Oregon Trail actually extended into what would become Washington State when the pioneers decided to push on beyond the Oregon Territory. The Simmons-Bush hello Dorothy, wagon ran from Missouri, St. Joseph, New Missouri, to the Willamette Valley. But when the travelers arrived, exhausted and nearly starved, the leaders of the train were told, "We don't want you here." Or to the leader of the train, Michael Simmons, "You can stay." But to the other leader of the train, "We don't want your kind here. Yeah. You go on." Well, this was a story I had certainly never heard. And although I think they do teach it in the schools, but I went to
Yeah, they're
school
beginning
somewhere
to,
else.
yeah.
So, Honey Bun, what was the rest of the story?
Honey bun.
Honey Bun.
Well, thank you, sweetie pie. We're half-baked ideas here anyway.
You've got to be so careful what you say to her.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, the American side of the river was the Willamette Valley, the south side of the Columbia, where the British had control of the north side in Fort Vancouver and the Hudson Bay Company, and they had Fort Nisqually up here at the Sound. And so we were in competition with the British to see who would bring out the settlers and really have the better claim to the Oregon Territory. And we were bringing out the settlers on the Oregon Trail. And so one of the reasons they made that long trip from May until December to get from St. Joseph to the Dalles was not only economic reasons and patriotic reasons, but also racism was coming to a head in pre-Civil War Missouri. And George Bush, one of our founders, was part black, and he had a white wife, so the kids were mixed race. And so they thought, well, maybe we can escape this whole racism thing by going way out in the wilderness to the end of the Oregon Trail. And so they came out to the Oregon Territory and found out that the American side of the river had already made an ordinance that anybody of color that tried to settle there would get periodic whippings. And so they hadn't escaped a thing after that drudgery, terrible trip to make it all the way our Oregon Trail. They found out, well, they were in a quandary. What do we do? Do we want to go to California under the protection of the Mexican government? Or Simmons said, well, we're right next to the British side. We'll get in good with Dr. McLaughlin at Fort Vancouver. And that's what they did. They stayed that first winter splitting cedar shakes for the Hudson Bay Company at Fort Vancouver and earned their keep, so to speak, and proved their character. And also the British were used to interracial relations with the Indian tribes and the Hawaiians and the Chinese laborers and everybody, French trappers. And so the racism issue was no big deal to them. They were used to that. And so they liked the Simmons Bush Party, they liked the character, and they said, well, next spring you can go up and explore into Puget Sound, of all things, British-controlled territory. And so Simmons and Bush, and they did that and came to the Deschutes River and saw the waterfalls and the water-powered industry, and that was his vision of a new market, and that was going to be our first name, New Market. But the Americans liked the Indian name of Tumchuck, or Noisy Water, and so we Americanized that, and that's how we became Tumwater. But Simmons was the leader, and it was racism in Oregon that helped start Washington, really.
But the rest of the story.
There you go.
Okay. A couple of things. One and two of my favorite parts of this story didn't happen, but I don't care. I'm in media, you know. The first thing is what I loved. Well, George Bush's name mostly in most history books is given as George Washington Bush, but apparently that really wasn't his name, and I'm forbidden from ever saying that again.
It's hard because it's put on signs and
everywhere,
and
yeah, but
and everywhere it calls him George Washington Bush, but Washington wasn't his middle name.
So if it wasn't even his first or last name.
No,
not
but
at
there
all.
was a George Washington that was the founder of Centralia.
Yes, I just expunge that whole thing from your mind, but that is. But the other thing is that apparently didn't happen, that I love, and so I refuse to think that it didn't happen, is when the wagon train got to Oregon, and these people, you know, I'm so surprised. I just visualized the pioneers, the settlers in Oregon, coming out in their Birkenstocks and all that, and welcoming the Bush-Simmons group and bringing them in. And no, as you know, it wasn't like that. And when Michael Simmons heard the word that he could stay, most of the people on the train could stay, but Bush had to go. He said, he's the best man of us. If he can't stay, none of us stay.
Yeah.
And I don't give a darn whether he really said it. I love
We like
it.
it. He should have said it if he didn't. Yeah, that's right.
Well, yeah, and he meant it.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Obviously,
exactly,
he didn't mean it because they did. And then one other thing, and this is true.
Did they follow?
They did, all of them.
they all came up.
They came right here and made beer.
Well, no. That's a later. That's a Schmidt.
I was to the last talk. It wasn't that way.
Oh,
Yeah.
I wasn't. Anyway, no, but anyway, they did all follow him, yes.
Yes.
So, and because of that, now this is really good, and you probably know this, but I'm hoping you don't, because after all, George Bush brought with him from his farm in Missouri a number of different plants and trees, and his butternut tree is still growing on his farm. And how far from here is it?
No,
We could all
his
go.
farm was a whole section of land where now the Olympia Airport is, and both sides of Old 99.
Well, part of the Olympia
Prairie.
Airport, but there's a young family that owns, a couple of acres,
Uh-huh.
and they still have they are now growing sustainable food.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And the butternut tree still lives.
It's in danger. It's getting pretty darn old, but
Well,
they're saving
who
it. Somewhat.
isn't?
That's right.
And that is the rest of the story. Okay, do you want one?
There's a lot of nuts hanging on my family tree too. Okay, well let's see. Let us move on. I usually talk about Tumwater history, and we've been doing that so far. But when I worked with a radio station in Chehalis, I did a little series of history features for 4 counties, including Thurston, Lewis, Grace Harbor, and Pacific counties, because that's where our coverage was for the FM radio station. So I started to research and find these little cute stories, legends and so on, that we would find about each county. And so we made little 3-minute features talking over old times that we've adopted now for our history features here. But I found about Menlo, Washington. Do you know where Menlo is? Yeah. Pacific County. If you take the main highway from Chehalis to the coast to Raymond, South Bend, almost to Raymond, you'll come to Menlo, M-E-N-L-O. That's where the Pacific County Fairgrounds is. And there is the Pickled Pioneer of Menlo. You say, Pickled Pioneer? Well, it's an interesting story. And we have to go back to the old days of the Oregon Trail. The history of the West begins in the East, after all. And in 1855, we go back to Bethel, Missouri, and the leader of a religious commune called the Bethelites. Dr. William Keel was their leader. And as they were preparing to head for the appealing vision of a new settlement in the rich Oregon Territory, Dr. Keel's 19-year-old son, Willie, contracted the dreaded disease malaria. And this was an emotional event for the close-knit group, since the father and leader of the group, Dr. Keel, had promised his son that he would lead the wagon train, his son would. But just 4 days before they were to launch out on the trail, Willie died of that disease. So the tragedy became a further motivation for those Bethelites. They put Willie into a lead-lined coffin and filled it with whiskey that the Bethelites themselves distilled, called Golden Rule whiskey. And they made that airtight and put it on the lead wagon that was converted into a hearse, draped in a black cloth. And the vow to Willie was fulfilled because they made the entire trip out west led by that wagon. It said that it actually protected the party from Indian attacks. West of Fort Kearney, a war party of Sioux Indians approached the wagon train more than once just to take a look at the Pickled Pioneer. And it provided safety to the 250 people of the commune as various Indian war parties came to look at that dead man floating in whiskey. So the Bethelites eventually arrived in western Washington at a place near today's Menlo, an area they called New Canaan, and they buried Willie Keel on that little hilltop along the main highway there. And the marker for the gravesite is still there. It reads, "In the evening by lamplight, Willie was buried here, November 26, 1855. The community was not successful. The Bethelites decided the climate was just too wet, so they moved south to Oregon and founded the town of Aurora in a drier valley there. So that's the Pickled Pioneer of Menlo. So what do you think? Can you top that one?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Well, you know, that was not in those days. If they did decide, usually they didn't ship people home. I mean, you had to stay where you fell.
Yes.
But it was not unusual to pickle them in as they went. You know, so but that was very good. I hadn't heard that before.
It's a fun one,
That's
and
a
I
fun
can't confirm it. I mean, it's legend, but we think it's based on fact. So it probably takes some more research.
I have a confirmed one.
Good.
Now this one, this one's one of my very favorites. This is one of the ones that got me started doing this book, and it's about Mrs. Mahan's tablecloth. And I found the tablecloth at the Prairie House Museum in Parkland. And it's just, it looks like it's not a fancy tablecloth, but it's nice. It has pieces ripped out of it, but oh well. And the reason for the pieces being gone is that soldiers and the fellas that lived around the area, having no idea that the tablecloth would ever have any value, had torn off people to use to clean their rifle barrels pieces. So, but it's still, the tablecloth is still there. It's still at the museum. And they told me when I visited the museum that Mrs. Mahan lived very near, this was her home, but she lived very near the end of the Oregon Trail. Now, one thing, just like we were saying earlier, one thing about this, the whole part of coming up through Pierce County down to here, is that the Oregon Trail seems to have ended every place. And so I guess wherever they felt like getting off, they did. But anyway, they said she lived there when she knew that a wagon train was coming. She would cook a big meal, put that tablecloth and her best china, which she wasn't that good, but she was what she was able to bring, put it on the table, and she would walk up and meet them and bring them in for a good meal. And it must have been the most wonderful thing, and that is checked a lot of times.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So people wrote in their journals about how wonderful it was. You can only imagine, after traveling that far, to be able to sit down and rest and have something good to eat, and it was the best thing in the world. That really happened, no problem. Someone did point out to me, though, that Mrs. Mahan was not the only one who did this, that Dr. Tolmie at Fort Nisqually and a lot of others did the same thing. In fact, John Longmire wrote at the end of his journey that Dr. Tolmie had come out to talk to the travelers, and when he found out how tired, and I think we really lose track of how tired and desperate they were, and when he saw how tired they were, he went back to the fort and he sent them out a wagon load of beef, and they felt much better. As I was writing the story, though, now, I tend to type really fast, and I don't always get things right the first time. And so I wrote, the doctor told me, sent them a wagon load of beer, and they
and made them happy.
they felt much better. Well, anyway, it's a wonderful story, and I always loved it. And in fact, I did I used to do a little thing like here, You probably stole my idea, didn't you?
No, we were just thinking in the same way.
Of course. Anyway, I used to do, so I did one of these where I attributed our Northwest hospitality to Mrs. Mahan and all that. But then I got to thinking, the first wagon trains, the Longmire train, didn't get out here till 1853. And she was already here. What was she doing here? How did she get here? I mean, there were not trains.
Wagon train, probably, or by ship.
Well, actually, the earliest wagon train, she was here already.
All right.
And she did get here by ship. She was a soldier's wife. They were at Fort Steilacoom. And her husband was a private, which meant that when they came in to build Fort Steilacoom, he was sleeping in the barn, of course, with the other enlisted men. The officers were in the house. They bought a house and with a barn while they built the fort. And Mrs. Mahan had to stay across the street. They did build some little hovels across the street from where it's across the street now. At the time, it was just on the grounds. And so she was a laundress. The huts were there for some of the ladies were laundresses and some were not, but she was. She did not like doing the officers' laundry, but there you were. There was not much else to do. However, then with three other military families, they bought donation claim homes in Parkland. And that's what she was doing there.
Right.
I thought that was really good. And I checked everything. It's all true. And then the next thing I found was that, so see, it just keeps growing and growing. It turns out that she's the great-grandmother of Karen Vial, who you all won't know her, but Karen's was the mayor of Tacoma for many years. And she says that the that the family all had the story that she had come by ship, after
Okay.
after the soldiers were settled, and then the next story I heard was that she's buried on the Oak Brook golf course, which seemed unlikely, but she kind of is. She's really buried next to but you have to walk through the Oak Brook golf course to get to her house. But she was there first. If anyone has to move, it should be.
Yeah, the golf
Yeah,
course.
yeah.
That's right.
So anyway, that was kind of fun. That's really
that
one
is
of my
interesting.
very favorites. So now you could take it away, Chet.
Let's see. One that I came across when you're talking about the extension of the Oregon Trail to Tumwater, that extension from the Columbia up through Toledo, which was called Cowlitz Landing. It was the Cowlitz Trail. They called it the Cowlitz Trail. It was an extension of the Oregon Trail, so we can claim to be one of the ends. But it was notorious in Chehalis. The first name of that town was Saundersville, but it was famous for their boggy and swampy ground, really deep mud in Chehalis. And the road builders had trouble with Chehalis all the time. There was a pioneer saying at the time that said, "The horns on the oxen are to show where they are in a muddy road." And there was a story of a man that was riding a mule and got stuck in that mud and couldn't be budged. And then a Dr. Roland of Olympia happened by and he helped. He poured a few drops of carbon disulfide on the mule's back. And first the ears moved of the mule, and then his tail, and then suddenly it pulled itself out of the mud and quickly ran out of sight. And the mule's owner was amazed. He said to the doctor, "What is that stuff? Better put twice as much on me. I got to go catch that mule." So that's the story that I picked up there.
That's good. And of course, you checked that with two resources.
Well, no, I haven't. You had one, something about octopus wrestling?
Oh, octopus wrestling. Yes, I did. In fact, only last Friday, I got to interview the last of the octopus wrestlers. So that would be Gary Keffler, and Gary is, I called his home to see if we could interview him. I could interview him. There's no we anymore. And his son said, "Oh, I don't know." He said, we get a lot of requests, but he's quite elderly. He's 82. And I said, "Honey, I'm going to be 85 very shortly, and therefore I said I'm coming." So anyway, what I hadn't really realized, so we got working on this book, was that octopus wrestling was big here from about 1953 to 1969.
Recent.
Comparatively. And yeah, I thought it would turn out to be the old days when the pirates climbed ashore. No. And Gary was the world champion octopus wrestler. And what they did, the biggest octopuses in the world, it is not octopi, it is octopuses. And they grow in the narrows where the bridge is. And so they decided that they would have, they had a World Octopus Wrestling League, just like the World Wrestling League. And Gary was actually 3-time World Octopus Wrestling Champion. And he said to me, to start with, when they first started doing it, they did not have snorkeling gear and that kind of thing. Oh. And so he said, they would just have to go down as long as they could hold their breath. And he said, when you would go down, you could hold your breath 4 or 5 minutes. Well, I don't think so. I actually don't. But anyway, octopuses here grow up to, they'd said, about 80 pounds.
See, it doesn't seem fair because they have 8 arms.
Well, they do. That is true. They go along arm in arm and arm in arm. But there had been reports that there was a 600-pound octopus under the bridge. I suppose so. And what does he eat? Anything he wants. But my son, who is a diver, said that I had said that I just doubted that there could be one that big. And Gary said he never saw one. But my son, who's a diver, said he certainly thought that was a possibility. So it was quite interesting. Wow. But also, anyway, if they wore snorkeling gear, when the snorkeling gear came along, they lost points. So if you had to use, equipments to get down with, he said before the first World Octopus Wrestling Championship, they got worried. People were coming from all over the world. They had octopus wrestlers coming from everywhere. And they didn't, and I thought they had to bring their own octopus, but no. Anyway, because they were, and someone who was with us had asked if they didn't have championships in other places, and he said no, because they're the biggest here. Yeah. There's just no place else that's as big. And so he said the night before the wrestling championship, they seeded this area under the bridge the bridge was there. Under the bridge in along Ruston Way with 40 octopuses who did what octopuses do. They went right in their hole and stayed there. And he said, luckily they were able. It was interesting to see that, they looked very differently at catching octopuses and wrestling. Because he said, well, you had to keep the suckers off your face and that kind of thing. But otherwise, they just wanted to be left alone. They really, and now they are.
Yeah, they're left alone.
And so, but Gary said, it was interesting to me. One thing that I didn't put in the book that I was telling Don is that things have changed so much in that very, very short time that at the same time, before he started wrestling octopuses. He was the one, or with the team that caught Namu the killer whale, and took him to San Diego. And I thought, immediately my puckering string is pulled. I think because that's terrible. And he said, well, you got to remember, and this is very true. He said, you've got to remember, this is the big thing about history that we were talking about. You must look at the context of the times. And in the times, they were killing whales. They were shooting them. They were killing them any way they could. And he said, in fact, and there is something to this, if they had not started catching the whales and taking them to marine land where they were trained, we would not have realized as a people how smart they were and because we were just killing them. Now you couldn't do it. You're even uncomfortable to hear that that's what happened. And he feels like if they hadn't done that, it wouldn't have happened. Mm. And now you know the rest of the story.
All right, it's kind of
your turn, sweetie. Well, I've got at least one more good one. How long?
I can spout off a little bit.
How long does this? I got loads. How long? No, sir. I want all my turns. I never mind. I'm watching those people creep out in the back, but I don't.
Oh, there's a few. All right. Well, I have an underwater one too. It's an underwater ghost town in Lewis County. Oh. You ever hear of the underwater ghost town? It's a.
Well, I did, but it's not.
You would need scuba gear to visit it. It's Rife Lake behind Mossy Rock Dam. There was once a town of Cosmos, and it existed from the early 1900s until the town was torn down in 1967 because of the building of the dam, and the water flooded the whole site. But it was on Rainy Creek Valley as it joined the Cowlitz River, and let's see, I'll skip some of the founding of the town, but it was a Cosmos Timber Company, a timber town like so many towns were. And they had 3 garages, 2 general stores, a restaurant, a tavern, a welding shop, post office. School kids went to the Glenoma district schools. And the name of the town was initially Fulton, for a man who lived a mile or so down the river towards the town of Rife. But a flood washed out the home-based Fulton post office, and so it was moved to Hopkinson, the mill area. And that's where it got the name Cosmos with a K from the Greek word that translates the whole universe. And State Route 5 was the main road from Mary's Corner eastward, and about halfway to White Pass was Cosmos. And that road then branched out at Cosmos straight to the east in Chinook Pass, eventually White Pass, and Yakima. And then you can go north or left to Morton, and the heart of the logging country, and to Mount Rainier National Park. But the town of Cosmos became rather famous for flowers. The Cosmos Garden Club in 1950 won a national award for the best flower show and the best flowers in Washington. Mrs. Barrett was considered the outstanding flower gardener in the state, and she was the town's postmaster and became president of the Washington State Federation of Garden Clubs. And roses were her favorite, but she also had 35 varieties of rhododendrons, 2,500 gladiolas, and more than 100 varieties of dahlias. And she was one of the leading flower arrangers in the state also. So that was, in 1977, Rife Lake Reservoir was at a low enough level because of drought or whatever, 108 feet below normal, that the former citizens of Cosmos were able to come back and visit the old town site and reminisce. And it's back underwater today. So that's the underwater ghost town of Lewis County.
Very good. That was good. I got. Now you
got
don't have this one. I know you don't. Okay, this one is about when women got their right to vote, and the story I was told was that the women of Washington Territory were among the very first in the nation to have the right to vote. This much is very true. Receiving the vote in I can't read that. Who would write that? 1886. They lost it a year later, before Washington even entered the Union. Dispirited, they didn't try again for nearly a quarter of a century. And now, and of course, that's a story. Well, I have been surprised at how many people don't know that we had the vote.
Yeah,
And
it was States.
It was really all your fault. Well, when you think of it, of course, the other gentleman here too, because what happened. Now, the next election of importance was held in November. These are my Dollar Tree glasses, by the way. That way I can keep them in my purse and not worry about them. This was the way a Pacific Northwest politician summed up the election of November 1911, when Washington women won back the vote that many felt had been stolen from them in 1886. The women paid no attention whatever to the newspapers, to campaign literature, or to what our workers said to them. They went out, studied the situation for themselves, and voted as they damn pleased. The old line politician is as dead as a doornail. Women have revolutionized politics. C.H. Bailey described this pivotal moment in Pacific Monthly in July of 1911. And the person in the Northwest, in Washington, who was most responsible for what happened here was suffrage activist Emma DeVoe Smith. And I met Emma. I didn't really meet her. She's dead, you know. I went to her house, and the new owner, it had a new owner. It had just been sold, and she wasn't there. And she didn't know much. She said she really didn't know much about the original owner of the home, but she did know she'd been a suffragette. And so this was where we hung the story. It turned out that so I visualized, well, one, she was involved in it, but not too much. But it turned out that she was one of the most active in the country from the time that she was a little girl of 8. She went to one of Susan B. Anthony's lectures. And Susan B. Anthony asked what she always asked at one of her lectures: who believes in women's voting? And little 8-year-old Emma DeVoe in those days jumped right up and stood there. And as sometimes happens in big gatherings, nobody else, I'm surprised other ladies didn't get up and stand with her, but they didn't. They kind of left her. I guess they were waiting for someone to come scoop her up or something. But she wouldn't sit down. And because she was saying, I'm going to do something about this. And she was right, she did. She saw it in very simple terms. She said, what is politics except housekeeping on a big scale? So we had been the 5th state, so we were originally got the franchise. But now when this chance came up again, Emma was not going to see us lose it. And she did what today, the most remarkable thing is that she actually did what we would now call a branding exercise. She put out more than 1,000 pieces of advertising, and it was not easy in those days to do so. And she insisted that every woman who was eligible, who would be able to vote, be contacted and told to influence her husband. See, that was how it had to be, because we'd lost it the first time because of you fellas. I mean, no offense. I mean, Don't
you have an artifact, or I guess not a book actually, that she had a hand in writing?
Would you just kindly wait? Do you think I don't know how
just...
to do you think I don't know how to do this? Is this one? So,
I want patience, and I want it now.
Oh. I said that to my husband. I said, God is trying to teach you patience. And he said, well, he's wasting his time. And so, okay, so does this mean we're no, okay. See, I was building up interest.
Yeah, okay. Well, now I'm really interested.
So, but the big... Oh, dear.
I knew you brought that book with you, and it's related to this story.
And you thought I'd forgotten, didn't you?
I did.
I know. Okay. What the big thing was, this is so good, is that she invited all the women interested in suffrage in Washington and the United States to write a cookbook. And it's called the Washington Women's Cookbook. And inside it says, if we have the vote, we'll cook for you. And you can
good strategy.
You can see.
That would sway us men.
It's full of all sorts of recipes. There's how to take care of a typhoid patient. Interestingly to me, the Mountaineers Club was founded around the same time, 1911. Most of the members were women, and I had not known that. But anyway, she did do that. She put together the cookbook. As far as I know, they did continue cooking. And sir, correct.
And you're still voting.
Correct. I was going to say, I believe we've got the vote. What do you got? And how much more time do we have?
We have about 15 minutes or so. Maybe if we can have some Q&A afterwards or something, if you'd like.
No, I don't think so.
No. Okay. All right. Maybe just questions, no answers.
I was going to say, if they have any questions, they're going to ask them now. I mean, there's no use. We don't draw this out.
Well, I do have one of a modern history, too. You ever hear of a local community celebrating Undiscovery Day?
Yes.
You ever hear? Yeah. Dorothy's heard about this. But Grace Harbor County residents might recognize that as relating to the formation of Ocean Shores as a town. And it became official in 1970, so it's a really recent official town. And the developers began laying out a development in that, 1960s when they bought 6,000 acres that has that whole peninsula there. And a development called Ocean Shores Estates was created. A dream put on paper, and roads were begun, and lots were laid out. And the Executive Villa Motel was built, and a big-time promotion began, initially using the slogan, "Where the sun almost always shines." But former big band singer Ginny Simms bought into that vision, and she built a restaurant and a club near the beach. And hers was the place that hosted the group of famous Hollywood folks like Hugh O'Brien. Remember Hugh O'Brien?
Oh, yeah.
Jane Powell.
I remember
Paula
Ginny
Raymond.
Sims.
Ishka Bibble. And the Guadalajara Boys were his group. Anyway, the Stars all said that they'd purchase lots there, but few followed through on that. By the end of the decade, the development company went broke, but there were about 438 permanent residents in 1970, and in November of that year, they decided by a 2-to-1 margin to incorporate as a city. And that was there was a guy, the holiday that they called Undiscovery Day, that was the brainchild of a very creative promotions man named Bob Ward. And Undiscovery Day honored the date in 1792 when Captain Vancouver sailed past Grace Harbor without even stopping to explore. So it was Undiscovery Day. Bob also came up with the February Fog Festival, which makes sense. The Clam Prix, a race, and the National Kick the Can Super Bowl he also promoted. So he was a real promoter, very imaginative guy. A big celebrity golf tournament hosted by singer Pat Boone and others. That was a big thing. Ocean Shores is still going strong today with the big Shiloh Inn and the Lighthouse Suites and the Quinault Beach Resort and all that. And so that's Undiscovery Day in the town of Ocean Shores. So
That's
little
lovely.
tidbits,
Yes.
little bits of tid.
And the Fog Festival At the Fog Festival, they gathered at the shore, on the shore, in the whole townspeople, as many as would come, and shouted, "This way, George," feeling that...
Over Vancouver.
Because they felt like their whole life would have been different, you know. So, okay, I got a funny one for you, too.
Good, okay.
Okay. I feel this is descending into chaos, but I'm kind of liking it. Okay. This is from Lakewood, just up the street, you know. And the story I was told was this very brief, was this, listen, you ought to go over to Coffee's Frames store in Lakewood. She's got these dummies out in front. And they're telling a whole story. It's better than Twin Peaks. Well, maybe. And you know, you all know Lakewood because it is just up there. It's a small city with a big, proud timeline. But this was the story that people loved. This is the ballad of Barbie and Ken. You see, one morning, Barbie and Ken were sitting out in front of Coffee's Frame store, and nobody knew where they came from. They were life-size mannequins, perfectly dressed, and the lady that owned the frame shop, whose name I could find if I took the time, Judy Gunnell. She every day dressed them and put them out in front of the store, and they sat there together. They didn't wear the same thing. They had nice wardrobes. You know, they didn't say anything to anyone. And no one said anything to them, yet that was not considered to be a fault. So they sat there, and as time went on, the chairs seemed to move closer together, closer and closer. Now, they were there for a long time. It didn't have to go fast, you know. But one could tell there was definitely something in the wind. Not downtown Tacoma, no. No, but we could tell something was blooming. And sure enough, in the summer of the next year, which I forget which year it was, but trust me, they got married.
Ken and Barbie.
They did.
Yeah.
Barbie had a beautiful, beautiful wedding dress. Ken didn't dress up as much, but you know how guys are. You know, we did. The minister it was all in the paper, the minister who married them wore shorts with a flag across. He was kind of a middle-aged, portly gentleman, not to mention any names, of course. Anyway, and so he performed the marriage, so they were legitimately and completely and truly married. And we were all so happy. You know, it's nice. Sometimes you just like something to go the way it should go. And they bought a house. The real estate agent who sold the house to them said, "Oh, they were so great to work with. They didn't object to any of my suggestions." Well, then Barbie got pregnant. We were a little surprised because we don't know, but then there you are. So what happened? Old people's nose runs, you know. Just be ready. Okay. Anyway, so she was expecting a baby, and then she had the baby, and it was kind of a little 3 foot, 2 foot plaster baby like they used to have in baby stores. You remember? Well, they was very cute, and so sometimes the baby was outside, and sometimes they kept the baby inside if the weather was bad or whatever. And things were going really, they could hardly have gone better. They would, what you'd expect in an all-American city like Lakewood, and then catastrophe happened. One morning, Ken wasn't there. There was nothing but an empty chair. He was gone, and nobody knew where he was. Worse yet, one of the garbage truck men came by and said that they had seen his dismembered body out at the LeMay refuse place.
Oh, no.
Now, nobody knew why, and this really happened. I mean, this really happened. Well, it was terrible. Barbie was distraught. And she had to send to Germany for her mother to, I didn't know she was German either, but she was. She had to send to Germany for her mother to come watch the baby while she tried to see what had happened to Ken. And so it was just awful. Everybody was so disappointed because, it had been an ideal relationship. And then what happened finally and I cannot tell you the exact day, but I'm pretty sure it's written down somewhere because I was walking through Lakewood with Mayor Bill Harrison. And we came to Barbie. Barbie was still out. She was trying, bravely to struggle on, hoping to get some clue to what happened and all that. And I saw Ken. Ken is sitting right there with her. And Bill said, Mayor Harrison said, well, no, it's not Bill. It's Calvin. Calvin is Ken's cousin. Oh. Calvin's cousin Ken has come to console Barbie. Oh. And I noticed right away, one thing about Calvin's cousin Ken is that he only had one hand, but that could be enough, So he had kind of a flowing sleeve over the other one. Oh, but anyway, it looked hopeful. There was romance in the air again, definitely. And I said, that's just so nice. And Mayor Harrison said, yes. Romance blooms in Lakewood. It's that kind of a town.
Was his last name Klein? Calvin, I mean?
No.
Never mind.
Never mind.
He might have been better dressed. The one I highlight is just a short thing. The town of Winlock in Lewis County is famous for its poultry farms and egg raising and so on, egg farms. And they became so well known for their eggs and their chickens that they started a celebration called Egg Day. And then they have a gigantic egg in Winlock made out of plastic now, I guess it is, but that's kind of their town trademark, I guess you'd say. So every year they have their Egg Day. And then the town of Toledo, not too far southeast of them, was famous for their cheese factory. And so they have Cheese Days, and they have their town Cheese Day festivals, even still. And I always thought the two towns should get together and have Omelet Day.
Oh.
So that's my quickie.
Oh.
We should do Q&A, shouldn't we? Do you think we should?
Well, if you have your heart set on it. I got more stuff.
Well, yeah, I do too, but we could be here for a couple hours.
Does anybody have questions? Oh, she does.
Here we are.
You mentioned that Mr. Bush's name, wasn't George Washington Bush, and it may not have even been George Bush.
No, it was George Bill.
It was George Bush. Yeah, it was.
He meant he wasn't related to the current president or the.
Yeah. President. But there was a George Washington, former slave, that was the founder, or one of the founders of Centralia to the south of us.
But I'll tell you what: if you really want to piss local historians off, call him George Washington Bush and see what happens.
Did he have a middle name?
No.
No, not that we found. The headstones don't have anything on it for a middle name, and the records from back in Missouri and so on don't have that. So, but it's on all kinds of engraved in stone at the George Washington Bush Middle School and all kinds of places. So it's hard to change when that pattern gets started to correct it all.
Are his descendants still in the area?
The last we knew, there were some descendants in the western Washington that were some daughters that didn't have the Bush name, but now we've lost track of them too, so we don't really know. Haven't seen any relatives or descendants that we know of. But there are legends that they passed down through the family about the Bush family, so it's fun to check that out of the state library. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. We do have one more talk in our current season, and that'll be Thursday, June 14th, and we have the return of Dennis Larson, who's an expert on Oregon Trail, but also Ezra Meeker, and he's going to talk about Ezra Meeker in his senior citizen years, retracing the Oregon Trail and promoting it and marking it, and so it's going to be a very interesting talk on Thursday, June 14th, right here, same time. So thank you for coming.